Good evening and welcome. I'm Carrie Weber. I'm the Frank and Clara Meditz Executive Director of the Fairfield University Art Museum, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you all here this evening. Thank you for joining us on this quick session and the kickoff night for the Fairfield University Art Museum's 10th anniversary season. So year and season, fall season. Again, we're so pleased to have you with us for this exciting program tonight. We are celebrating tonight not just the beginning of our 10th year, but also the opening of the exhibition Ruby Sky Stiler Group Relief. Now, in normal times, we would be gathering in the museum's Walsh Gallery, where the works are installed, in the Quick Center for the Arts. We'd be there together in person, experiencing the wonderful program you're about to see. Our esteemed guests would be on stage in the theater. We'd follow that program with eating and drinking and wonderful conversation. I don't know when we will have opening nights that look like that again, but I am hopeful that it will be sometime in the not too distant future, and we'll look forward to welcoming you all into our spaces then. COVID-19 has changed many things, as you all know. There's much sorrow and tragedy and anxiety associated with our collective experience of the last 6 months. One of the positive things that have come out of the museum's pandemic experience is that we are committed to making all of our exhibitions and programming virtual and available online from this point going forward, so that they reach much larger audiences and are accessible to anyone who wants to see them. On our website, on the exhibition webpage right now, you can see images of Ruby's works in the exhibition. And Ian Barry will be showing you installation shots shortly during the course of the presentation. But please stay tuned, because we do have a virtual exhibition coming soon. Before we get started, I want to thank everyone who made this exhibition possible during these challenging times, especially my museum staff and all of the lenders to the exhibition, and of course, the artist and guest curator, who you will be hearing from shortly. It's kind of a gloomy, muggy afternoon, evening here in Fairfield, and right now I'm thinking it is really nice that you can watch this in the comfort of your homes without having to battle the traffic on I-95. For those of you who've been to our openings before, you know that that's a real battle. And without getting rained on, because I think it's about to start raining here. Anyway, we're thrilled you're here to be with us this evening and to enjoy the program. I've just a little bit of housekeeping to take care of before we dive in. Ruby and Ian would be delighted to answer your questions at the end of their conversation. So please ask them. There's a chat function. If you scroll down on your screen, you'll see a box. You fill in your name and go from there. You can ask questions at any time during the course of the conversation, and I will be back with you at the end of the program to facilitate the Q&A. I'm really sorry that most of you cannot see this exhibition in person, as the museum is closed to the public this fall because the university campus is closed to outside visitors. As of right now, only students, faculty, and university staff will be the lucky ones who will have a chance to see these beautiful works in person, but we will definitely let you know if that changes. And if you're interested in learning more about Ruby and her work after this evening, please join us on September 22nd for a virtual gallery talk with Professor Catherine Schwab, who will discuss the classical influences in Ruby's work in more detail, because I have a feeling that may get discussed a bit tonight. And on November 5th, we hope you will tune in again for a virtual conversation with Amy Smith Stewart, Senior Curator at the Aldrich Contemporary Art Museum, and Melissa Huber, Assistant Curator at the Costume Institute at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Their subject will be the body paramount, gender, tradition, and design in the work of Ruby Sky Stiler. Now, without further ado, I would like to introduce our distinguished guests. Artist Ruby Sky Stiler was born in 1979 in Portland, Maine. She received her BFA from Rhode Island School of Design and her MFA from Yale University School of Art. Over the last decade, her works have been included in numerous solo and group exhibitions. She currently lives and works in Brooklyn with her husband and 2 children, and I've been told that you may hear from her children a little bit later. Nicole Beauchesne gallery in Lower Manhattan represents her work. And we want to give a quick shout out to Nicole and thank her for her collaboration around this exhibition. Our other guest and the leader of the conversation this evening is guest curator Ian Barry, the Dayton director of the Francis Young Tang Teaching Museum and Art Gallery, and professor of liberal arts at Skidmore College. He has organized over 100 museum exhibitions for the Tang and museums across the country, across the United States. Please welcome Ruby and Ian.
Hey, thank you, Carrie.
You're welcome. Have fun.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Just to start, before you leave us, leave our screen. Thank you so much for the invitation and the beautiful exhibition. Ruby and I got to be with you in the gallery to install the works earlier this week, and it was such a pleasure to be together and have you bring these works in person together and see them all in one place. So thank you for that. And it's our first collaboration between Fairfield and Skidmore, and we hope it's the first of many. So thank you, Carrie.
Thank you,
Carrie.
Have fun.
Ian, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, good.
Hey, Ruby, where are you?
Oh, so I'm in my studio in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, and let me get rid of my face. Let's see.
What? We love seeing you.
Well, you could still see me. So yeah, I'm at my studio in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, and you guys, you really may hear my kids screaming at some point here, so just bear with me because my husband and I, we're both artists. We have studios on this level of our home, and then we live vertically above this studio space. So it's, the best and the worst.
We'll call it the best in this moment. And it actually might, we'll get to later your the amount of artists that are around you and who helps and influences, but it must be in the best times really great to have another artist nearby in your building.
Yeah, I mean, I feel really lucky in that way. I mean, Danny and I are truly partners in our various projects of being, artists and having a daycare and having now a first grade, and also it's like a terrible restaurant that we run together. So we have a lot of projects together, and I'm glad that we still love each other after the last couple of months. Happy to report.
Thanks for having us in your studio for a little bit tonight.
Yeah.
So Ruby and I were talking earlier, and we're gonna since many of you, we think that many of you who might be listening in, particularly at Fairfield, haven't met Ruby before or haven't seen her work before. That we would start with some background and start with the beginning and talk about her trajectory up to this point, and then turn on the images and show you some pictures of the show before we get to your questions. So Ruby, where were you born? Where did you grow up? What was growing up like for you?
So I could tell you anything I wanted to, Ian.
That's right, and we believe you.
So I was born in Maine, but then I moved to New Mexico. So I really lived between those two places. And then I ended up going to Rhode Island School of Design for printmaking. And then just moved to New York with the rest of my people. And I went to grad school at Yale University School of Art for sculpture. And then I dragged Danny back to New York after that. So that's...
You zipped way too fast through that. I'm going to wind you back. So when did art first come into your life?
So I think, this is kind of dorky to say, but I think it was just a part of my life from the very beginning. My parents are both artist types, And I feel like it's really good for me that I love to be an artist and to make art, and it's natural to me because I don't feel like I have any other applicable skills. And so I think it just always was like a huge value in our household, in our various households. And my siblings are artists, and we didn't have other examples. Does that make sense?
So the idea of seeing the life of an artist, or having an artist mentor, you were surrounded at all times by those examples and mentors.
Yeah. So that's the path that was the path for me. I would find it difficult to know. I think I actually applied to one college, and it was Rhode Island School of Design. I really don't think I applied anywhere else.
So from New Mexico, how did you know about the Rhode Island School of Design?
Well, I think it was in the air as like this iconic art school. And also my stepbrother had graduated in painting before me. So I kind of knew about it like you do when you're 17, like you just know one thing. And I was lucky because I had an art history, or I had an studio art teacher that kind of helped me shape a portfolio and helped me get in there. So
that's awesome. And RISD was a good time for you? Good.
Such a good time. Such a good time.
What kind of work did you make when you were at RISD?
So good. The best work. Well, I was a printmaking major at RISD, and it's funny because like in retrospect, I mean, now I know what printmaking means, and at the time, and you have to think about this in the context of Providence in the 90s, there was a really rich music, kind of do-it-yourself, like squatter culture, and I really thought that if I was a printmaking major, I would be in a really cool band, and we would be making a lot of democratic ephemera, and then I entered, the printmaking department, and literally the first thing that we did the entire first week of being a printmaking major was grinding a lithography stone to just prepare the stone. Sure. And it almost like, I mean, obviously we had light, but in my memory, it was by candlelight. Like that's how it is in my memory. So I realized that printmaking is a very sort of like antiquated medium, but I loved it in some ways, and it became, I think, really foundational for me in terms of kind of something to push against the flatness of. And I think we can talk about this more if you want to, but I think that like foundation of everything being so flat became like a kind of organizing structure for how I make sculpture. I still come back to that play between 2 and 3 dimensionality in my work. And then, later when I went to grad school, I went for sculpture.
Mm-hmm. And in grad school, you were focused sculpture the whole way through. And how did you see art and artists when you were you going to museums? Did you look online? How did you do research, or were you blinders on and in your studio and learning how to craft things?
That's a really good question. I think I learned a lot at that time. Actually, when I was in New Haven at Yale, I felt really isolated from the city. And it's weird because it's so close, but I felt really, stuck there. And thankfully they have amazing pizza, because that was the one kind of thing that buoyed my spirits. But it was a lot of influence of my, always the people around me, the artists, my peers. Always I've been more keen on connecting with my artist peers than with the faculty and the kind of like lecturers. And like, I remember the lecturers coming, and all of myself and it's so funny in retrospect, but we would always be like, oh my God, Matthew Barney, blah. Like, and now in retrospect, I'm like, I was 24 years old and I've done nothing. And I'm talking about Matthew Barney's body of work. And so, but I think I've always been, and I totally give respect to Matthew Barney now, but just for the record, but I think I've always been really connected to my peers and the other grad students that were there were really important to me.
Is that part of the reason of moving to New York? You came as a group, you had a gang, you had a
gang. And I also think, I mean, I don't know if you did live in the city, right?
Never have.
Never have. Okay, well, you might someday. Maybe. So if you want to move to the city, tell you what, I'll give you some tips. But I think when I never felt totally connected to either of the places that I grew up, and I think that New York City has an attraction for people that don't have that kind of sense of home. So I think I just felt like, oh, I knew this was going to be my home. And I've always had a lot of forward momentum just as a person. And I've always felt like New York City is the center of everything. So now everyone's leaving. But
well, you're there and you're making work. And, you know, it's a strange time. I mean, maybe we'll get to it when we talk to people. But, I mean, it's a totally strange time. You're in New York, you're starting out. When do you become an artist assistant?
So I worked right after, I moved here in 2001. So actually right after 9/11, I started my first job working at the Lower East Side print shop as a studio assistant. I did that for a year. Then I worked for Tom Sachs for a few years, the artist Tom Sachs. And that was a really important time for me because I learned a lot about making things and his sensibility in terms of, he's an artist that kind of appropriates, among other things, really low materials and kind of pushes them into these much more elevated forms. And so I learned a lot about really just like the hands-on of how to make things in a sculptural way after coming from this printmaking background.
And so what did your work look like at that time? were you working full-time as an artist assistant and then making your work too, or
well, it was like one of those times that I feel like really defines you, because it's like you're working full-time, living with like 12 roommates and 16 boyfriends, and also fitting your artwork and drinking so much. You know, you really have to be obsessed with your work to push through that period, because there's a lot of pushback, you know. But so yeah, I was working. Sometimes I would wake up early in the morning to work in my studio, which was just adjacent. My roommates and I had like what can only be described as like horse stalls that we would sleep in, and we had studios outside of those horse stalls. And then I would work in the morning, I would work for Tom during the day, and then usually I'd go out at night. So yeah. And
so when did the interest in antiquity come in? Let's like zoom to what we're going to be talking about in this show. Okay. So how did that enter your your huge Rolodex of sources which come from all over? But antiquity seems to be a really unique and somewhat defining characteristic of some of your recent work.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking about, I think big picture, I think that weirdly being American has a lot to do with it. I think it's a way of feeling connected to a longer trajectory, and you know, there's something about seeing things that have lasted for centuries that gives you a feeling of connection, and it has to do with everything, mortality and existential everything. So I think there is that there, living in such a new place as America is. But so that's like a loose framework, but like I'll share this anecdote that I have said before, but I think it's relevant. Is that in like, I think it was maybe 2006, right when I finished grad school, I went with some friends, some artist friends, and Danny, my husband, to we were going to Naples for this funny group show, and like my first group show ever. And then just incidentally, we visited Pompeii. Like, I think literally it wasn't a plan even, it was on a whim. And so while we were there, I mean, obviously I was really struck with the forms of the, you know, classical architecture and art, but also there was this really interesting story that was unfolding, that was being told to us by our hosts who worked at the museum. They were archaeologists that worked at the museum. And the story was that apparently some of the restoration of the frescoes was at the site of Pompeii, which is, you know, this extremely special place, were restored with the wrong color. And science was telling them that it was an imperfect restoration. And so I just thought that was like such a funny, like amazing kind of narrative of how our sense of these like really canonized places are kind of like always changing, and our, you know, our sense of authoritative history is vulnerable. And so when I came back from that, I was really struck. I was very interested in, you know, the beauty of the place, but also just in this idea of like trying to create an object that had that sense of authoritative history and, you know, the kind of Greco-Roman, the importance of the Greco-Roman form, and then like kind of like make it in this way that you realize as you come up a little bit closer, it's like made of really low materials, and the iconography like spans, you know, civilizations and entire cultures, and a lot of it was like invented by myself, so it's not an expert's perspective. And so those pieces were made of foam core and hot glue and paint.
While you're talking, I'm going to pull one up so we can all see what you're. There you go.
Yeah. So
this is foam. This is what you were just describing, yeah?
Yeah, that's what I was just describing. And that, I'm not good with dimensions, but I would say that sculpture is like as big as like tall as like a large man, with his hands on his hips and like a huge belly.
We definitely have a visceral picture of it now.
Yeah. So,
and here, just I wanted to show this one so people could see some of the detail of what you're talking about piecing this together. I love the idea of the lesson of history and who tells history and history changing, and you know, that is such a, you know, what an important moment. And you had there a moment of realization and a moment of how to connect that to something very contemporary.
And I think also this kind of established this convention for me, where I realized that I feel the best when I'm trying to create something that feels whole from parts, from maybe not having exactly the right parts on hand, and kind of like that gesture of striving to make something that works and kind of like is more than the sum of its parts. It feels like it feels like a really humanly a gesture that's connected to, you know, humanity.
And so these images are from your research, yes?
Yeah. So you mean the cartoons that you're seeing in the place?
Exactly.
Yeah, so I'm looking at like a lot of, at this time I was looking at a lot of like, old art history books, and taking liberty to draw.
Sure.
I don't know the myths, but certainly you wouldn't be able to piece together a narrative from these objects, and a lot of these parts were also somewhat just invented
Mm-hmm.
to sort of give this aura, of like an authentic object or a historical object.
Well, that is an awesome way to start talking about some of the works that are in the show. So, um, for those of you on campus, I hope you can stop by, and look on the Fairfield Museum's website soon for some really fantastic photographs of the show. But this is what you see when you walk in, and we're really proud of it. We're it really fills the gallery. There's 14 works. Some sit on the floor, some sit on the walls, some are very open form, and some are these brand new works that are being shown for the first time. And this is a really exciting to see them all in one space. And I hope you see um, some of the details, or some of the um, memories or aura of that pot that we were just looking at, in some of these new works. You can see some of the shapes, you can see some of the figures, and then when we get to it on the works on the wall, you can see how the evolution of the figure and pattern uh, has matured, has evolved. Ruby, what does this look like to you when you see these works that you made very, in different times and different headspace, all together in one room?
It feels so exciting and so good. I mean, bringing this together, I've been thinking so much about how much I miss seeing art in person and dealing with objects in person and dealing with people in person. And there's something that is so goes beyond the object when you can move around it. And I mean, it was really satisfying to do this.
And what we were just sorry to interrupt, but just that idea of being in space and looking at this photograph. Say, I forget the name of your photographer who did such a great job. What was his name?
Stan Narton.
Dan did a really wonderful job yesterday taking these pictures for us, and the this very picture where you would rarely get to see this bench sculpture from this side, and how it turns into a line drawing in space, very much like those line sculptures on the pedestal in the back. I mean, it's just great to see the connections, and those are things that we sometimes take for granted that we can do when we're in spaces with objects and we have access to museums and access to collections where we can move around and really feel the weight and scale and size of things. This is another good example of that. This is a sort of front corner of the gallery that has two line sculptures with two smaller, less figurative works on the wall. And if you, depending on where you are in the space, these sculptures reveal themselves to be very, very dynamic works. I really love this connection with the wall work too.
Yeah, this was like, you thought of this like a vignette within the show, which I really appreciated. And I think it really is a nice, sort of a little bit of a different rhythm.
So talk about these line sculptures a little bit. So I hope you're all seeing the figures. There's a lot of figure. So the vessel form and the human form become kind of combined in these line forms and become volumes. But you like them together. You like them put together, Ruby.
Yeah, I mean, I love to see them almost as drawings in space. I think there might be a view where you can really see them as a tangle. And the way that I think about these sculptures is sort of like, actually, I think it might refer back to my printmaking and sculpture, kind of duality, because it's like that really simple gesture of how to, break into space from a flat object. And the way that I started to think about these sculptures is like how to just like reduce and reduce and reduce figuration until you only have the most essential geometry to tell you about a figure. And these are kind of deceivingly simple because I have to sit with these forms for a long time to see what else can be removed and reduced to leave those, those lines that tell you something. Yeah.
And remain freestanding. So there's a sculpture problem to maintain at the same time.
Sculpture problem. Yeah.
So this bench is one of the two benches in the show, and there's Emily from the gallery showing us that they can be actually used as benches. So what was the idea to bring these forms and make them, instead of their lines, actually very solid? These are in some ways the opposite, filling in those.
You know how it is when you start to think about something, like a few different ideas registered to me around the time that I was thinking about these. And one of them was really like thinking about how to create an exhibition that would move from Fairfield University and eventually go to the Tang, which is where, ultimately the show will wind up, and potentially be in a slightly different form, since because of everything we're pushing forward, a year, 2 years, anyway, pushing forward. But when I started to think about this idea of creating an exhibition, I knew that I wanted to approach it site specifically, which is my intuition in general. But I couldn't figure out, because they're wildly different spaces. So I started to think about like the conventions of the museum, and the museum viewing bench was one of the conventions that I felt like I could explore. And I also thought, I was really interested in, the idea that a viewer would be invited to sort of see themselves participating in narratives that are being depicted in the works on the wall. And I mean, Ian, you and I sat together in the gallery. I mean, I think there is something very visceral and unusual about both pushing your body against an artwork that plays with the exact language of sculpture and other sculptures in the room. And we've been socialized to never do that, as well as, the more intimate gesture of really putting yourself against a human figure. So I was just really interested to see where that would take me. And then also the title of the show, Group Relief. This show came together over the last how long have we been in this nightmare? So I kept thinking about that title, and obviously it's a quadruple entendre for the relief artworks on the wall in the show, but also the idea of getting some relief, and hearing, in the news constantly that word relief, like relief packages and global relief, and then, you know, within my works on the wall, there's high relief, there's low relief, there's bas relief. I think the idea of seating yourself in the gallery space was something that I thought was beautiful, and that we could use.
Fantastic. And it really, for those museum people who are listening in, it is a really great sort of reference to a history of museum benches and viewing, and I'm really excited to see these travel to different locations and different museums in their long lives. Can you talk a little bit about the process of fabricating these before we dive into the figures and what's going on in them? But this is a project you needed some help to make, right?
Yeah, I mean, as you can see from the work in this show, I have many different parallel processes, and some of them do require working with people that, you know, can make these things, and then a lot of my work is really hands-on, detail-oriented in the studio, and has to be made with my hands. So I think that gives me a range of activities in my life. I need a lot of solitude, but I also need to be out there in the world too. So there's some balance. And for these benches, for example, I worked with my friend who is also with me at RISD. He graduated at the same time as me, he and his wife, and his name is Max Wang, and he's a furniture designer and fabricator. And so he and I kind of just worked on, he had to educate me about, you know, the tenets of making furniture, actually. And not like it was like didactic lectures, but just like in friendship, he gave me skills and some visual references. And, you know, like we started to think about like, well, what part of making a bench is important for structure and what part is, I didn't really want to add decoration, but I did want to decorate necessary structural elements. So you can see that scalloped edge. Well, that's part of the way that these benches, you know,
they structurally work.
Yeah. And yeah, and we developed, basically, then I also worked with another artist friend of mine, Mike DeLucia, who is a master with a CNC cutter, and he was able to kind of see how these things, you know, could be set up spatially and kind of turn a drawing into a real object in the room. So
fantastic. It's wonderful. It's wonderful. The figure that we're looking at and the painting or the wall work behind it are both images of fathers and children. And I wonder if we might focus in on that just a little bit.
Yeah.
I think that is a really, it seems such at times a really sweet image, and it is a very intimate and sweet image, but it's also a bit of a subversive image, because mothers and children are the images we see more often, and reclining nudes are women. And so having this reclining male figure and the father, you know, talk about how that sort of entered this body of work.
Well, forever I've been representing female figures, and that is an ongoing piece of what I am drawn to. And I think, you know, the female figure is this iconic form. You know, it's like almost every artist has explored that form. But I would try to bring male figures into my iconography, and I struggled with that, and I just couldn't find the right geometry for men. And it's funny because like my husband Daniel Gordon, who's a photographer, we talk about this all the time. Like it's really, really tricky to represent men, and I think a part of that is because we don't have that many images of a male muse, and we're really accustomed to looking at women through fashion and art and motherhood. And so when I started to think about representing men in more kind of gentle, nurturing roles, I was able to find geometry for them, or lines for them, and shapes for them that were more kind of empathetic or more forgiving. And so I thought that was kind of like an interesting problem to explore. I mean, and then I realized there really aren't so many images of men as images of fatherhood, in contrast to, you know, as you were saying, the just plethora just of motherhood. So I think, you know, I like the idea of creating more of that, of holding that up as something to aspire to. And I also, you know, like I think Western, you know, kind of like Greco-Roman visual references are still a part of, you know, my work, among many other kind of visual references, including Cubism, and lots of different modern practices. But I think the idea of like using some of those visual references and bringing a male muse to the center is something that feels kind of punk and like interesting to play with.
I love that you mentioned, you know, Cubism and along with the classics, but I'm seeing all kinds of things. I'm seeing comic books and textile fashion, you know, fashion design, and you know, I love seeing this detail of the patterns. You can get a sense, for those of you who haven't seen these in person, you can get a sense of the many parts that make up Ruby's work, that are all handmade and in her studio to make these composite wall works. And you know, we can see so many different traditions around the world, from very ancient to very contemporary, in those patterns in the background. Are you looking at some of those things? Am I on the right track with that kind of range of sources?
I think, you know, like cartoons, anime, American advertising, you know, like Louise Nevelson's like monochromatic assemblage, and even like lace patterns, other kinds of textiles, contemporary fashion, old fashion. I mean, I really have an intuitive approach to bringing in all of these different references, but really I'm kind of striving to create my own language. And you know, I think you can kind of see from where I started with those images that we spoke about. Like I'm in a different kind of world, and I'm building on it.
This one, you can really see in this detail that there's a work on the left, and then on the right that is an image, a detail image of the same work. And you can really see your drawing, that in this series you're leaving a lot of that drawing very visible. Can you talk about that? Are those meant to be read in a way, or is that just another layer of pattern that you're using as a part of your material?
I mean, I'll just tell you guys what the materials are here, because sometimes I think that's confusing. The the way that I work is on a table and I'm piecing together parts basically. I feel like my process is actually really sculptural, although these live on the wall. When you see them in person, you can see that they're really, really dimensional, and they're made almost in like something akin to how you might construct a mosaic, I think. So I layer paper and coat it with layers of acrylic, and I use an airbrush, and then sometimes I like will rub in those contrasty areas. I'll rub in like a really thick acrylic resin so that you can see, like when I polish the surfaces, you can see the high relief creates that contrast. But basically I'm working with paper. And so a lot of times I'm using all of these marks, these kind of like, you see a lot of process marks, kind of my thinking marks. And also you can see what my daily life comes into it too, because I'll be working, but then, I take a phone call, it's like a doctor's appointment, or maybe I need to go grocery shopping, or I'm organizing a birthday party, or I'm like dealing with some health issue, so like I kind of let like the multitasking, which is just the way that life is, kind of come in because I'm just working with paper and pencil a lot of the day. Maybe it's like something I hear on WNYC, or, something that I just don't want to forget, or a cartoon that I like. And at a certain point, I started to let those incidental marks kind of come in and become a part of the proper sort of formal elements of the artwork. And I almost feel like it's this way of saying that I was here, and it's like a graffiti mark. Yeah.
It's fantastic. It's fantastic. I encourage everyone to on campus to come by and see them in person. Ruby, thanks for this conversation. Really fantastic. And we, we're hopeful for some questions. Carrie, thank you for coming back and joining us.
We do have a couple of questions.
We're ready.
Are you ready? All right. From Catherine, she says, "Hi, Ruby. Do you have Catherine? Hi, Ruby. Do you have one or two works that you are most proud of? And if so, which are they and why?"
Oh, okay. Okay. In this exhibition or in the world?
I'm thinking in this exhibition.
Okay. All right. Let me think about that. It's a funny question for right now, because this work is it's like a gang that's got back together again from the last 2 years. So I love them all differently. I like my 2-year-old and my baby, you know what I mean? But I think I'm really proud of that father and child piece on the wall, actually. And it's hard for me to put a finer point really on why, but that's one of the problems with art, right? It's just hard to talk about sometimes. I like that one. I'm proud of that one. And I also really love the father and child bench too, because it was a real struggle to balance the technical problems with that and the magic of the form.
I have to say, I love that the father and child bench is flesh colored and the woman reclining body bench is blue. I adore that. Another question from Michelle: once all the museums in the world have reopened, is there what museum and what specific gallery do you envision yourself sitting in that you just can't wait to be back there? And if so, what are you looking at?
Oh, that's such an escapism fantasy.
Right now it is.
I don't know exactly how to answer that one, but I will tell you that I'm very excited. I have a date this Monday to go with my friend. Shout out to Sarah Crowner to see the Met we made an appointment to see the anniversary exhibition, which I'm like thrilled. So yeah.
Will you go visit any favorite old gallery while you're there to see the temporary exhibition, or will you just?
I think we're gonna see the anniversary exhibition, which will probably be the full.
Plenty.
Yeah.
We're going to be also out of practice at going to big museums like the Met, right? Where you need like stamina. You got to build up that stamina.
I know, our feet are going to hurt.
We have another question from Patrick. Ruby, have you ever experienced opposition to one of your works for being suggestive? Or do you find that it's just commonly accepted in the art community to?
Because of the nudity?
I think so.
I like that question. I haven't really had that experience. It's funny though, because sometimes I think about like what we accept as a nude versus, being naked. And I think for women, for depictions of female figures, it's pretty accepted as a it's not necessary. You can represent women in the nude, but I have thought about that with men, and what's going to turn into a topical, get more topical than where I really want to go with this artwork. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
I'm really trying to make things that like people are not putting you into this one headspace. I really want to make things that move around and feel connected to the past and the future and maybe to your own body. And so I have thought about what's gratuitous. Yeah, but I've never had pushback before in that way.
Annie asks, during quarantine, has there been a new technique or material that you've started working with?
That's a good question. I mean, it's been a nonstop conversation in my house because we actually just started to have help with our kids, but we've been squeezing in our work really on the edges. I've been working on prints, actually. I've been doing a lot of printmaking, and I always return to printmaking, and I think you can see that it's really a part of my practice, so it's not such a stretch. But I find that the way that I'm making prints is really accessible, and it can be quick, and it's like sketches for bigger things later. And, I can kind of like have that feeling of like the physicality of being in my studio, which I've really, really missed, actually. And I kind of looked at this head on, that I've really missed my work, like the actual physicality of making things during this time. So I find with printmaking, I can like spend an hour even, and like I have an object that I'm looking at,
Nathan asks, for more than a century, modern artists have sought to distance themselves from classicism in different ways. What inspired you instead to choose to reinvent it?
I didn't know that. I think that I'm not taking credit for reinventing classicism, but I think I was just intuitively inspired by that story that I told you guys and that visit to that place, and it was almost incidental the way that it entered my work, and I continue to be really interested in that stuff and that iconography. But of course, my work changes as my mind changes and my life changes, and I change and evolve. So I think I'm just on on my own journey.
Okay, I think, oh, I was going to say we have one last question and another one just came in. Oh, no, I have one more. Catherine asked, she said she's taking some courses in women's studies and is interested in what it's like to be a female artist. Do you ever find that you are underrepresented in the art world?
I feel like I've been really careful to choose my partner and create a really egalitarian relationship where we're like mutually supportive of each other, and I feel really supported in my work. And that said, yeah, I have sometimes felt that it's not completely fair, but I think that there is opportunity, and I persevere.
One final question, and we will end with this one because it's adorable. Annie wants to know what your kids think of your work.
Well, my 1-year-old thinks I'm a genius, and my 6-year-old is really into my work, and it's a little bit of a competition. Not a competition, but it's maybe a little bit of a tender spot between me and his dad, because he doesn't totally understand photography. He's like a little bit of a 19th century art critic in that way. So he thinks that like I'm kind of a real artist. But anyway, I think they really I think maybe they don't appreciate yet that their access to cool stuff in the studio.
They will soon. Yeah. If they don't already. Well, thank you guys so much. This was so fun, Ruby. It was wonderful hearing you. Great questions, Ian.
I can't leave without saying how much I appreciate both of you, Ian and Carrie, and also give a shout out to Nicole Bouchine, my gallerist, and to Catherine Schwab, who's helped so much. So an exhibition like this can't happen without all of this kind of support, and I really appreciate it.
Well, this was a great way to kick off the exhibition, and hopefully people will get to see the other programs and see the virtual exhibition and enjoy it in whatever way they can. So thank you both so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Carrie. Thanks, Ruby.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone.